Hey everyone, it's Smarty Pants Chess once again, and we've got another CCC11 semi-final game. This time it's between Komodo, who's playing white, and Leela Chess Zero, who's playing black. Now these two engines actually finished fairly close, actually on the same score, but it seems as though Leela managed to advance to the finals against Stockfish. But this game was fairly interesting, and I don't feel like it's Leela at her best, but we'll still play through it nonetheless. So the game began with Komodo playing e4, and this is the book, so e5, bishop c4, knight to f6, d3 and knight to c6. This is the end of the book, and Komodo continued with the move knight to f3. This has been seen many times, just developing a piece, attacking the pawn in the centre. The bishop comes to c5 from Leela, a very nice square getting active. And white played the move c3, so white's preparing either d4 or a b4 and trying to attack this bishop with a tempo. Black played the move d6, Komodo played bishop to g5 to pin the knight, h6 was played to attack the bishop, and Komodo retreated their bishop back to h4 and still maintains the pin. And now Leela played the move a6, so giving the bishop some breathing space on a7, and after castles, black plays bishop to a7, Komodo plays knight b to d2, and Leela hits out at the bishop, undoing this pin with g5, so the bishop is forced to retreat back to g3. So again, this is quite a nice setup for black. They've got some very nice pawns all on dark squares, and they've got a looming bishop on a7 attacking this g1 diagonal. The other problem is maybe the h6 and g5 moves have weakened the king side somewhat for black. So if black over advances, maybe white could counterattack. In the game, Leela continued with queen to e7, a very solid move, and Komodo played b4. So now Komodo's getting active on the queen side, either preparing knight to b3, bishop to b3 or queen b3, it's a very flexible move, and also preparing the move a4. And white will advance on the queen side. Leela played a very interesting move, played knight to h7, so I think she's going to reroute the knight to g6 or e6, so it looks like they're going to plan to play knight to f8, maybe even knight to g6, to support this kingside pawn storm that they've got going. Komodo played a4, so now they're attacking on the other side of the board, so we're getting a very interesting and dynamic game here. Leela put the knight into f8, and Komodo hit out at the knight on c6 with b5, and now black has a decision to make. They can play knight d8, is actually what happened in the game, but knight to a5 was also an alternative. Now, I don't think this is actually necessarily better for white, but it was rather interesting. So white should continue with takes, and if knight takes c4, white can continue knight takes c4, b takes a6, and white can smash open now the centre with the move d4. Black should reinforce with f6. After takes queen d5 attacking the rook, rook b8, rook to b1 and captures twice. If black played, let's say, queen e6, white can continue with moves like queen to a8. And I feel like white's got a slight edge in this position. So the queen on e6 attacks the knight on c4, but the queen on a8 attacks the bishop on a7. So whenever one side captures a piece, the other will follow. So if black continued with knight g6, which was the recommended move, white can play takes on e5, and if bishop takes f2 with check to regain a pawn, there's bishop takes, f takes e5 and queen to b8. It's given that white has a slight advantage in this position. So maybe it's because the queen is more active and the rook is more active, and white has actually finished the development with the king a lot safer. So for this reason, if we just go back to the very start of this variation, maybe that's why Leela didn't play knight to a5. Much more solid was the move she played, knight to d8. So I'm going to perhaps push this c pawn up and maybe even put a knight in to e6, which would be very nice. Komodo played h3, stopping any g4 ideas, at least for now. But Leela continued with the move h5, preparing g4 or even h4. So now again Komodo has a decision to make. In the game they actually play rook e1, but Stockfish actually recommends king h1 in this position, because after h4, bishop h2 and g4, white survives the attack with moves like knight to g1. Leela could continue, of course, with queen to g5, but after takes on g4, queen takes g4, there's a lot of trades. So queen takes, the trade of queens, b takes a6, b takes a6, bishop takes a6, and bishop takes f2. So the rook on a8 attacks the bishop on a6. But after bishop b5 checks, c6, bishop takes c6, knight takes c6, rook takes f2. In this variation, it looks as though white actually emerges a pass pawn up. So they've got a very nice a pawn with the rook behind it. That's going to go up the board, and of course white does have the advantage in this position. So king h1 in this position was definitely a viable option. Komodo didn't play this though, they played rook to e1. I think this is an okay move, but now Leela continues her attack. She plays h4, the bishop goes to h2, and Leela can continue with g4. So after h takes g4, Leela doesn't actually recapture this pawn straight away. She plays the move h3. So what this does is just advances the pawn further, and they've got a nice rook behind this pawn. So they can capture g4 at her leisure. She doesn't have to take it straight away. And I think Komodo played the wise move here, because they're not going to capture on h3, because then the rook just gets unleashed. So Komodo played wisely. They played b takes a6. Leela recaptured, and now Komodo shuts the bishop down on a7. They play the move d4. So Komodo's striking out in the centre at this e5 pawn, and Leela now actually just recaptures the pawn on g4. So what this does is actually twofold. It takes a pawn and also pins the knight on f3, which is supporting this d4 push that they've just played. To reinforce d4, Komodo actually played the move knight to f1. And this knight is very good defensively. It supports the bishop on h2 and can even jump into g3 to block some checks. So in the game, Leela takes on g2, and Komodo actually played knight to e3. So attacks g2, attacks the bishop on g4, and this g2 pawn actually does white a big favour by blocking any potential checks along the g-file, at this very moment in time anyway. So Leela continued, bishop takes f3, Komodo recaptured, and now Leela played knight to g6, getting her knight into the game. I was curious as to why Leela didn't take this pawn with e takes d4, but actually this is a terrible move, because now white can actually unleash the knight to g4, threatening moves like knight to f6 checkmate. And even after knight to g6, white's got an amazing attack here, because after e5 the rook is unleashed upon the queen and king, and also this queen attacks a8 at the same time. Black will be forced to play a move like d5 to avoid both attacks, but then bishop takes d5, the rook has to move to b8, and white can continue with moves like e6. Even after knight takes e6, they can play c takes d4, bishop takes d4, and follow up with rook takes e6. After f takes e6, there's bishop c6 check, king d8, and now rook to d1. And all of a sudden, the bishop on d4 is pinned and will be taken at the next move. Even if, let's say, black plays rook to b4, I believe white may be able to just play queen to e4, and again the doubly attacking his bishop and also the knight on g6. I definitely would prefer to play white in this position. So that's what happens if black takes on d4. So for that reason they didn't play that. They played knight to g6, but Komodo followed in with the move knight to f5, so attacking the queen. Leela moves it to f6, and now Komodo shuts up shop with bishop to g3, so supports this f2 pawn. And moving the bishop off the h-file isn't dangerous, because even if rook h1 in this position, white can take on g2, rook takes e1, rook takes e1, white is absolutely fine. So here Leela continued, queen to g5, and Komodo took on g2, so finally taking off this pawn, and the bishop is no longer pinned on g3. Leela continued rook h7, and Komodo took the pawn on a6. And here Leela may have had the option of playing bishop takes d4, because then the bishop on a6 is attacked by the rook. But maybe white can play bishop to b5 check. If c6, the c takes d4, c takes b5, a takes b5, rook takes, And it looks as though white again emerges a pawn up with an advanced b pawn, so this will easily be a win for white. Black has to play solid. Leela played knight to e6, attacking d4 once again with another piece. But here actually Komodo continues their advance. They play the move a5, so trying to queen this pawn, I guess, is at least as far up the board as possible, preparing moves like bishop to b7 and a6, and this will really shut down black's queen side. Leela continued, e takes d4, Komodo took, the knight recaptured, and here Komodo played bishop to b7 as we just discussed. So if Leela goes rook b8 in this position, white will continue knight takes d4, bishop takes d4 and e5, so the queen supports this bishop very nicely. If black takes on e5, then a6 is absolutely devastating, threatening to play a7, so the bishop has to block this. But then comes bishop takes e5, queen takes g2, king takes g2, knight takes e5, rook takes e5, king f8 and rook c1. After rook g7, king f1, potentially maybe black should have gone in for this because it looks quite drawish with the opposite coloured bishops. But I imagine white would actually win this endgame. I think it would take a lot of moves, but eventually I feel like the pawn on a6 and the bishop on b7 would be just too powerful for black's position. But again, this is only given us about plus 0.8 by Stockfish, so still it's a very close endgame. So maybe in this position Leela could have played rook to b8. In the game though, Leela played rook to d8. And potentially this is where Leela went wrong, because now Komodo actually comes out on top. They play the move knight takes d4. After Leela recaptures with bishop takes d4, Komodo played bishop c6 check. And after king f8 from Leela, there's a discovered attack. Bishop takes d6, and suddenly white's going to win the queen on g5 from black, after giving up some material. So rook takes d6 is played, and Komodo takes the queen on g5, and suddenly white has a very big advantage. Leela continued with knight to e5, and now Komodo played queen f5, attacking the rook on h7. Leela continued with rook g6, there was king f1, and Leela captured the rook on a1. So if we count the material at the moment, both sides have a rook and a bishop, but black has a rook and a knight for the queen. So that's 8 points versus 9, but also white has an extra pawn on the a file. So that's 10 points versus 8, and you have to say white has the advantage here. It was also possible, I think, for white maybe to play rook takes a1 in this position, because even after rook h1 check, king e2 takes, bishop d5 is quite annoying against black. And even after like f6, there's queen c8, king g7, queen takes c7 check, king h6, queen to d8. Play can continue king h7, bishop e6, preparing bishop f5, and if rook to g1, bishop f5 would come with check, and after knight g6, as queen takes f6. Black can take on a5, but then comes e5, and even after rook a2 check, king e3, check again with and bishop d3, it looks as though white is actually better in this position because this e5 pawn looks as though it's going to queen. So going back in this position, it definitely was possible for white to capture the bishop on a1 if they wished, but Komodo didn't wish. He actually played the move king e2 instead, putting their king into relative safety. Leela put their bishop back to d4, so it's no longer under attack, and Komodo played bishop to d5, so their bishop's no longer under threat as well. Leela still has quite an active position, so she played rook to h2, attacking this f2 pawn. And in the game, bishop takes f7 was played, and this is a very interesting move. This is because, let's say if knight takes f7, white can play queen takes g6. And even after rook takes f2, white does have to be a bit careful, because if king d3 here, there's knight to e5 check, which would win the queen. But after king to d1, rook a2, rook f1, it's very clear that actually black is losing this game. So bishop takes f7 was a great move. Another possibility that black could play here was rook takes f2, but again I think it wins for white, because white can clean up with queen takes f2, bishop takes f2, bishop takes g6, bishop takes e1, and then white should play a6. And after knight c6 to stop a7, king takes e1, king g7 and bishop to e8, knight a7 and king e2. So this should be a one endgame for whites, but maybe it was rather close. But after bishop takes f7, Leela actually played rook d6 in the game. Komodo continued with bishop h5 check, the king went to e7, and Komodo played queen h7 check, king d8, and now Komodo just sets black up to try and get them in an ideal position for checkmate. So there's a lot of checks here. So queen h8 check, king e7, queen g7, the king went to e6, and there's bishop to g4 check. So this is checkmate unless black takes the bishop. So this is forced. Knight takes g4, queen takes g4, again check, king e7, queen g5 check, king d7 and then queen f5 check, king e7, and finally the checks stop. So rook d1 was played. The point is that white wants to play rook takes d4, and if rook takes d4 there'll be queen e5 at the end of that and win one of the rooks. So rook f6 was played by Leela, queen to g5, so attacks the bishop on d4, and even actually e5 is a big threat here against black. So Leela played rook takes f2 with check, king d3 was played, again white still attacking this bishop. c5 was played in the game. After c5, e5 was definitely a possible move in this position, but maybe Komodo felt that this move, rook to b1, was a lot stronger. So Komodo's just going in for the kill here with rook to b7 check. Leela played king to d7 in this position, and now rook b7 was played, king c8 and rook to e7. The point is that white is actually threatening to checkmate black with moves like queen to g4 followed by, let's say, queen to d7. So rook d6 was played in the game, and now Komodo's got a forced mate, so they can play queen to g8 check, and if rook d8 in this position, Komodo will continue with queen to e6 check, king to b8, queen to b3, king a8 and queen to b7, which is checkmate. So after queen g8, actually Leela played rook f8, the queen took, rook to d8 was played, and Komodo finished Leela off with queen f5, king to b8 and king to c4. After bishop f6, Komodo took, rook d4 was played, king c3, rook to d7, rook takes, c4, and then Komodo finished Leela off with a nice checkmate, queen to d8. So I believe these two engines are rather equal in strength. This was a very close tussle, and I believe Leela just went wrong on one move, and I think it was this position where she played rook to d8 rather than rook b8. Again, if she played rook b8 in this position, there was knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, e5, and after takes a6, there was bishop a7. Again, after bishop takes e5, queen takes g2, king takes, there was a trade, and then after several moves, again this position is good for white, but it's still rather equal for both sides, and I think maybe Leela should have gone in for this position and tried to defend it with the opposite coloured bishop endgame. But anyway, hope you enjoyed my analysis. Let me know your thoughts if you noticed any other variations. There were some great comments in my last video and a lot of variations that I didn't see, so thanks for pointing those out. It was very interesting to look at. And again, if you've got one of your own games that you'd wish for me to discuss, I'm happy to do that and probably make a video out of it. Just send it my way. But anyway, hope to see you lot in the next video, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. So see you next time.